All right, we want to bring in now Mr. Michael Kimmage. He's a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the U.S. and a professor of history at the Catholic University of America. He held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio at the U.S. State Department in the second term of the Obama administration. Professor Kimmage, it's good to have you on the day. You wrote last month that Russia will not let Ukraine go without a fight. Now, if that is true, why is Vladimir Putin, why is he even bothering with any attempt at diplomacy? Was today's video call with Biden, was it just a big show?
I don't think it was a big show. I think it's as real as diplomacy gets. And I don't think that Putin exactly knows what Biden's position is. Sometimes the rhetoric on Ukraine for the U.S. is very supportive. Sometimes it's more ambiguous. I think he wants to try to figure that out, see where Biden stands, and measure his options against where the White House is. And I think it's a dance between the two of them. It's not set in stone, so the diplomacy is crucial.
I want to stay with Putin for just a moment. Why do you believe that he would be willing to go to war, possibly involving the United States, just to keep Ukraine within Russia's sphere of influence?
I think it's not just sphere of influence, although that plays a role. That's sort of a matter of status and prestige. But I think Putin views Ukraine, the territory of Ukraine, as crucial to Russian security. And he sees the West, and especially the United States, moving closer and closer. So I think in his eyes, we, of course, in Washington see it differently, but in his eyes, it's about the defense and protection of Russia.
And Putin is betting that America does not have the will to enter another military conflict. And I would go so far as to say that he is betting that Washington will throw Kiev under the bus if push comes to shove. Do you agree?
I don't know if he's betting that Washington will throw Kiev under the bus. I think he's assuming a certain level of support, and you heard that in messaging from both the president and from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan this afternoon. But I think in Putin's assessment, what he may see is that there's just not enough support from the United States to get Ukraine through a war with Russia, which is, after all, militarily the far superior partner to that conflict. So the U.S. will be on Ukraine's side, but perhaps not to the degree that would really deter Putin. And
is it facing any threat via Ukraine from the West?
That's in the eye of the beholder. I think in NATO's estimation, there's no threat whatsoever. NATO's a defensive alliance. There are many who feel that Ukraine's prospects for entering NATO are dim to non-existent, but that's clearly not how Putin and the national security establishment in Russia reads this. They do see this as a threat, the expansion of NATO generally. And in particular, it's not just NATO. The United States is helping to train troops in Ukraine. There's a growing military relationship between Ukraine and the United States, and that is perceived in Moscow acutely as a threat.
You know, the United States has never slapped Russia with economic sanctions, which known as the nuclear option of sanctions, which would be cutting Russia off completely from the international financial system. Would Biden, do you think, would he push the button if it meant averting war and containing Russia?
Well, I think that's hard to say. I can't imagine the Biden administration would sanction Russia preemptively. So the sanctions would come after the fact in the midst of a war. Although the threat of sanctions could have a deterrent effect. I don't think anybody really knows what the effects would be. And there's an added complicating factor, which is the European dependency on Russian gas, which is something that Russia would play with on its side. So what you'd see in the event of a war is a major conflict between Europe and Russia and a major tug of war over various economic instruments, energy on the Russian side and financial instruments on the side of the West.
I mean, would we be looking at the Russian economy here possibly collapsing if it was unable to sell its oil and natural gas one side? And would we also be looking at a severe blow to Europe's economy because it wouldn't be able to get access to that natural gas and oil?
I think neither Europe nor Russia would collapse in the midst of this kind of conflict, but the stakes are very, very high. And of course, we're in the midst of a pandemic with substantial supply chain problems already present and on the horizon. So all of that would get substantially worse. Of course, Russia has a partner in China, which is a major energy consumer for Russia. So it has other avenues if the relationship with the West is to fail. And the same is true for Europe, of course, that it could find other sources of energy. But until all of that would get sorted out, it would be extremely painful for everybody involved.
I mean, if you were a fly on the wall today, listening to this video call, what would, in your opinion, what would be or have been the wisest statement to have come from U.S. President Biden here to diffuse the situation?
I think the wisest statement is to lay out with clarity what the U.S. intends to do in the event of a further invasion on the part of Russia. I'm sure Biden did that. And I think simultaneously, Biden needs to create the conditions for genuine diplomacy with Russia. These are the world's two major nuclear powers. There's no way in which either leader should allow this to spin out of control. We've already got a kind of Cuban Missile Crisis on our hands, and it demands deft diplomacy. So you begin, I think, with the sticks, and then you get the role that diplomatic back and forth could play. And I'm quite sure that that's the libretto that Biden followed.
A Cuban Missile Crisis in the 21st century, that's quite a statement. I mean, tonight, considering what we've seen today, what chances would you give diplomacy? What chances do you give war?
I think in some ways, I'll be melodramatic for a moment, this is worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved in a fairly simple way. The U.S. took some missiles out of Turkey and the Soviet Union backed down. I don't see either side backing down in this case, and you've got lots of actors on the ground, Ukrainians, Russians, and lots of accidents that could push this crisis forward. So it's a much, much more difficult crisis to resolve, and yet the stakes are sort of as high as they were in the fall of 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the variables are greater in number, and the scale of the crisis is comparable. We're not in a safe place at all with the situation.
Yeah, that's not a very positive assessment, Professor Kimmage. I hope you can come back when we've seen some movement on this, and hopefully the movement will be in a peaceful direction. Professor Kimmage, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.